About a minute and a half. That's freezing in my classroom. All right, let's go ahead and get started. So I really would like to randomly call on some of y'all, but I'm not going to quite do that to you guys yet. But be prepared for those days to come. So what I would like for you guys to do is, as I read these questions, feel free to chime in with your answer. You can partially answer the question if you only know like one of the two. And, you know, it's just kind of like a free flow. You can also kind of play along in the chat, but I'd much prefer you guys speak up just like we were in a traditional classroom. So number one, what are two biological processes or chemical reactions that involve an interaction with interaction with carbon between the atmosphere and the biosphere? So what are two chemical reactions or two very famous important biological processes that involve an interaction between the atmosphere and biosphere, an exchange of carbon, if you will? Anybody? Yes, photosynthesis and cellular respiration. So photosynthesis and cellular respiration are both really important biological processes that cycle carbon back and forth between the biosphere and the atmosphere. Photosynthesis is a anabolic process, right? So it's a chemical reaction that builds a molecule. Plants take carbon dioxide, water, and sunlight and combine them together to produce a carbohydrate known as glucose, C6H12O6, and they produce oxygen as a waste gas. The plant can then use the glucose through cellular respiration to provide energy for the plant, or it can also use the glucose molecule to build new structure in the form of cellulose in the cell walls. Now, cellular respiration occurs in plants, and plants can break down the sugar, and they break down the sugar in the presence of oxygen if it's aerobic, or without, which would be anaerobic, and that releases carbon dioxide, water, and energy into the cell. And that carbon dioxide could be re-released into the atmosphere. Or in the case of a plant cell, it could be cyclical, and the carbon and oxygen could simply remain in the cell. Now, with animals or heterotrophic organisms, organisms that are not capable of photosynthesis, we have to eat our glucose, right? So we eat the plants, and then our bodies break down the glucose molecules, and we release carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. So there's a really intimate relationship there between animals and plants. Decomposition is also an interaction, but decomposition is just going to involve some form of cellular respiration. Number two, as more carbon dioxide dissolves into the ocean, we will continue to see a change in pH. This change in pH affects shell and exoskeleton formation of marine organisms. What is this issue called? Yes, Madison. Anyone else? Come on, speak up. It's crickets in here. My first period was rapid firing these answers off. Yes, Elias. That's absolutely right. All right, so you guys are boring me, so I'm just going to go ahead and give you the answer. It's ocean acidification, right? Now, oceans tend to have a pH around 8, which makes them slightly alkaline or basic. Because remember, pH measures whether a solution or whether a sample is acidic, basic, or if it's 7, smack dab in the middle, neutral. If you don't know the pH scale, I highly recommend that you go and Wikipedia or give it a Google search, because that is something that you should have learned hopefully in middle school, right? Now, since oceans are naturally alkaline with a pH of 8, as more carbon dioxide dissolves into the oceans, they form carbonic acid, and it affects the ocean pH. It's lowering it. And we call this ocean acidification. Now, the weird thing about this is it doesn't mean that our oceans are becoming giant pools of acid. It simply means that the pH, which was 8, is decreasing closer to neutral. And that really affects the marine organism's ability to form these calcium carbonate exoskeletons and shells. So as more carbon dioxide gets produced into the released into the atmosphere, more carbon dioxide ends up in the ocean. We're going to see a decrease in marine life as a result of these shells and exoskeletons not forming properly. And that's not good, because we're talking about phytoplankton, right? Phyto means plant. So plankton, so phytoplankton, these are like the basis of the marine ecosystems. Number 3, where is most of the carbon on Earth? What is the largest carbon reservoir? The largest carbon reservoir, where we find the most carbon on planet Earth, is going to be in the geosphere, right? Trapped in rocks. Oceans would be number 2. There is actually very, very, very little carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. There's not very much at all. Most of it is trapped in the geosphere in various forms of rocks or fossil fuels, as well as dissolved in the ocean. Okay. Number 4, why do living organisms need nitrogen? So why do I need nitrogen? Why do plants need nitrogen? Why do bacteria need nitrogen? What do they use nitrogen to form? Yes, Elias, absolutely. Anybody else? Yes, Madison, definitely a part of that. Okay. Yeah, so we need nitrogen to form amino acids and nucleotides, right? Amino acids are really important for making proteins, and nucleotides are an important component of nucleic acids. And a very famous example would be DNA, right? So nitrogen is important for making proteins and making DNA. And so they need to get nitrogen. It's an essential part of their biochemistry. Number 5, the atmosphere is the largest reservoir of nitrogen, but it exists mostly in an inert state known as diatomic nitrogen, right? And inert just simply means it's very stable or very unreactive, right? So although we need nitrogen to make protein, to make DNA, and a majority of it's in the air, we breathe it in and we breathe it out. Our body has no way of grabbing onto it and using it in that form. It's happy like this. So how can we, in plants, it can go in one and out the other, right? As far as respiration is concerned, right? They can't just grab it out of the air either. So how do plants and animals get their nitrogen? What process or processes allow assimilation to occur within the biosphere? So how do we take this inert diatomic nitrogen and make it available to the biosphere? What is that process called? And it can be abiotic or biotic. There's actually more than one way that this can occur. Yes, Austin. It's not decomposition, but Austin, you're right. Anyone else want to take a stab at it? Yes, Madison. Yes. Okay. So this process right here is known as nitrogen fixation. In other words, there are microbes, bacteria that exist in soil, and some of these bacteria have mutualistic symbiotic relationships with some plants. They actually live in the root nodules of the plant. And these bacteria have special enzymes that can convert, they can break down diatomic nitrogen into a form that the plant can use, or into forms that other plants can assimilate. And this is called nitrogen fixation. If bacteria are doing it, it's biotic nitrogen fixation. What is a form of abiotic nitrogen fixation? What is a naturally occurring source of a tremendous amount of energy? Yes, how? Yes, Madison, it's lightning, right? So during a thunderstorm, lightning can actually split or cleave diatomic nitrogen. The nitrogen will then grab onto a nearby water molecule or oxygen or hydrogen, and it'll actually fall with the rain. and that is abiotic nitrogen fixation. And that makes it available in some kind of organic or inorganic form to the plants in the ecosystems. Now, assimilation is simply the process of the plant assimilating it, right? So it first needs to be fixed before the plant can assimilate it into its amino acids and DNA. Number 6, plants can assimilate ammonia and ammonium, but they have a biological preference for nitrate. What two-step process converts ammonia or ammonium into nitrate? So it goes from ammonia or ammonium. First, it's converted into nitrite with an I, and then eventually into nitrate. Once it's changed into nitrate, the plant is more readily, it's more readily available to the plant. Anyone know what that process is called? Yes, Troy. Yes, Brady. That is nitrification, right? So there are lots of bacteria in the soil, nitrifying bacteria, that can nitrify ammonia and ammonium into nitrate. That's nitrification. Bacteria are accomplishing it in the soil. So soil bacteria are really important. And later on, or actually throughout the entire semester, I'm going to be talking to you guys about the importance of soil bacteria. They're incredibly important. And so soil has this like microscopic food web, right, filled with bacteria that are driving a lot of these essential processes. Number 7, how can excess nitrogen be removed from soil and water back into the atmosphere? And so I alluded to the fact that this commonly happens in wetlands, right? So you get an excess amount of nitrogen and it can be released into the atmosphere. Now, as plants and animals decompose, that's called ammonification, right? So as plants and animals die, the nitrogen in the amino acids and the DNA, it breaks down through decomposition. And it's a special kind of decomposition known as ammonification. And that'll produce various ammonia and ammonium compounds. Now, what about the ammonia and the ammonium and nitrite and nitrate? When it breaks down, how do we get it back to this state right here? How do we get it back to diatomic nitrogen? Yes, Austin, it's denitrification, right? So these nitrogenous compounds can be denitrified in wetlands, and that releases the nitrogen out of the soil, out of the water, and back into the atmosphere. So the cycle can kind of continue again. Now, there are some situations where actually these nitrogenous compounds are broken down into nitrous oxide, N2O, and that's actually laughing gas, believe it or not, but it's a very potent greenhouse gas. And we'll talk more about nitrous oxide later on in the semester. All right, so it seems like quite a few of you guys need to hit the drawing board and go back and watch those videos and maybe do a little bit more studying in regards to the readings. I really hope that you guys are reading the readings that I'm assigning to you, because if not, it's going to show. All right, let's see here. So I'm going to go ahead and exit from there. And I'm going to take a quick look at our checklist for the day. So, right, we just did our warm questions. I'm going to go over TQ 1.4 and 1.5 here in a minute. I want to talk to you guys about the phosphorus, sulfur, and water cycle. And then here you've got your readings tonight, as well as your 2 TQs that are due tonight. Now, word to the wise. When I offer these readings to you guys, you need to read them. If you're not reading them, my discussions and my lectures are not enough. You have to remember, in a traditional classroom setting, we have an hour and a half, not an hour of class, right? And so over the course of the week, we're losing, 2.5 hours of class time, right? So the readings are really important to keep you up to speed. Now, let's see here, TQ 1.4 and 1.5. I'm gonna go ahead and go over those really quickly. All right, TQ 1.4, second period. And I don't know why some of you guys aren't doing these, and that's going to hurt, man. Look at that. 6 people did not do it, right? And that's 6 people are going to catch a 0 for that assignment. So let me go to TQ 1.4. That's 3 multiple choice questions. Come on. All right. So it's about the carbon cycle, right? And this cycle is incomplete. You're going to see lots of different diagrams. Some are going to be very complete. Some are going to be incomplete. Some are going to be focused on one aspect of the biogeochemical cycle. And some are going to have numbers showing you the actual number or the amount in each particular reservoir or how fast things are occurring. But sometimes you get things like this. Which of the following major storage reservoirs of carbon stored in the form of carbon dioxide is not represented in this diagram? The two main reservoirs are the geosphere, or like sedimentary rocks, or just rocks, and the ocean. And the only one of those two that I see here is the ocean, right? And so the ocean is a significant, it's number 2 in regards to storing carbon, with the geosphere rocks being number 1. There would be very little carbon in algae and soil bacteria compared to the amount of carbon in the oceans. Okay, so we're asking what process reduces the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere? So you got carbon dioxide up here in the atmosphere. What is the only process removing it? So you follow the only arrow leaving, and that'll be photosynthesis. That's why plants and phytoplankton are so important. Any photosynthetic organism is our biological answer to the accumulation of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. They're the only living things that can perform photosynthesis and remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and fix it into a form that ecosystems can use. So plants and phytoplankton could be our biological answer to climate change as a result of increasing carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere. That's why deforestation is so problematic, because we're removing the very thing that could potentially remove that excess carbon dioxide. Based on the diagram, which process most directly results in the storage of carbon as coal, oil over millions of years? So coal, oil, and natural gas are fossil fuels, and that implies or refers to the fact that they have a biological origin, right? So as living things die and decompose, some of those carbonaceous compounds or carbon-containing compounds can actually solidify into something like coal, or they could liquefy into oil, or exist as a gaseous state in natural gas, right? So decomposition is going to first start the stages of fossil fuel formation. All right, and now let's go over 1.5, the nitrogen cycle. Second period. Shame on you, those 5 of you that didn't do it. All right, so the largest reservoir for nitrogen is the atmosphere. And you can see that this is a very different diagram than what we've looked at so far. But again, you need to be able to interpret a lot of these graphics and these diagrams. Which of the following pathways indicate how nitrogen is added to the largest reservoir? Well, if the atmosphere is the largest reservoir, which of these arrows is adding nitrogen to the atmosphere? And I only see 2 arrows pointing to the atmosphere: volcanic action and denitrifying bacteria. So you can see that right there. Okay, so when you see a little pond, this is a wetland right here, right? So a lot of waterlogged soils contain bacteria that perform denitrification. That's why wetlands are so important for water purification. And then volcanoes can obviously release a tremendous amount of nitrogen. All right, so here is like a little cyclical graphic showing you the various steps of the nitrogen cycle. And this question is asking, which of these is nitrification? Now, nitrification produces nitrite and nitrate. The names kind of tell you what they make. So nitrification makes nitrite and nitrate. So that would be step 3. Step 4 is how we go from nitrite, nitrate into nitrogen gas. This would be denitrification. Now, for us to get from nitrogen gas into some form of organic nitrogen, this is going to be some form of nitrogen fixation and a little bit of assimilation in there, right? So the bacteria need to be able to take the nitrogen out of the atmosphere through fixation, and then they themselves will make compounds in addition to the amino acids and proteins that plants can make once the usable form of nitrogen is assimilated. Now, once we make proteins and DNA and we live, we'll eventually die or we'll excrete wastes. And our nitrogenous wastes, or the nitrogen-containing compounds in a decomposing organism, will break back down into ammonium or ammonia through ammonification. All right, let's see here. And the last one. So here you got a Venn diagram, right? Comparing and contrasting phosphorus and nitrogen cycle. We haven't talked about the phosphorus cycle, but it does reference it in a part of the reading with the nitrogen cycle. One of the most important things to realize about nitrogen and phosphorus is they're both limiting factors. They can limit plant growth. The amount of plants in an ecosystem, more or less, are going to be determined by a couple different things. You know, how much space is there, how much sunlight, what are the temperatures, but more importantly, how much nitrogen and how much phosphorus are available in the soil. They're both essential for plant growth. They are both the two essential ingredients in most plant fertilizers, with the third being potassium. And we'll talk more about that later. So go ahead and exit out of there. And let's go ahead and start our lesson for the day. So the first thing I'm going to talk to you guys about today is the phosphorus cycle. And what I would like you to do right now is stop what you're doing and make a mental note or write it down on paper. Phosphorus is the number one limiting factor. The amount of productivity that an ecosystem has is determined mostly by the amount of phosphorus. And there are two main reasons for this. There's two main reasons why phosphorus is the number one limiting factor. First and foremost, it is slightly insoluble in water. What in the world does that mean? Can anyone tell me what this word means, insoluble? If I were to tell you that phosphate and phosphorus is slightly insoluble in water, what does that mean? You guys are killing me. This lack of participation. Yes, thank you. Yeah, it doesn't dissolve very well in water, right? And so if most of phosphorus, the largest reservoir of phosphorus is in the geosphere, right, trapped in rocks, and we know that rocks can be pushed to the surface through uplift, and they can be broken down through various forms of biological, physical, or chemical weathering, you know, water usually being a major part of that, and then distributed around the globe through the hydrologic cycle. But if it doesn't like to dissolve in water, that can be problematic. That's why this is a very, very, very slow cycle. And so plants are just sitting around waiting for phosphorus to slowly dissolve out of the rocks, or out of the phosphorus or phosphate containing rocks in the environment. Now, there is another contributing factor to this. There is no gaseous state of phosphorus or phosphate, right? So there's no atmospheric component, right? Now you can find various phosphorus containing molecules or particles floating around in the atmosphere. Maybe it's some kind of like silt or sand or some kind of particle, but it's not going to be suspended in the air for long, and it's not going to circumnavigate the globe like something dissolved in a cloud would, right? Or as a gas, right? So there's no gaseous component, and it's slightly insoluble in water. So this is really, really slow, right? So it's the number one limiting factor, numero uno, okay? Now, when it does finally partially dissolve out of the rocks into the soil, right, plants can then assimilate it. They can make DNA, right? So one of the important things that plants need phosphorus for is to form DNA, as well as a really important energy molecule known as ATP. Now, once the plants have access to phosphorus, they can grow and go through their life cycles, and then obviously animals are going to consume the plant tissues, and the animals are going to assimilate those phosphorus-containing compounds into their tissues. Again, DNA, ATP, as well as bones, right? Believe it or not, bones have a substantial phosphorus concentration. And then eventually, like all things, will die and will be decomposed, and the decomposers will break down those phosphorus-containing compounds, re-releasing phosphates into the soil. Now, as water and rain passes through and across the surface of soils and rocks, it's going to carry a lot of that phosphate. And phosphate is the common form of phosphorus that we see in nature. It looks like right here, PO4 -3. So it's just a phosphorus attached to a couple oxygens. So this is how we typically see it in nature. Once the phosphates end up in a solution or in the ocean or lake, they're going to precipitate, which usually means they kind of fall as a solid down to the bottom. And then over time, through sedimentation, cementation, or lithification, they too can become rocks, and the process starts over and over again. Now, one of the major problems with excess or a growing concentration of phosphate or phosphorus in the water is something known as an algal bloom, right? Since phosphorus is the number one limiting factor, a lot of algae and phytoplankton and aquatic plants are just sitting around waiting for phosphorus. And if a lot of excess phosphorus ends up in that aquatic ecosystem, we'll see an explosion in the algal population and the phytoplankton. And they'll grow and grow and grow and multiply, multiply, multiply. But eventually these phosphorus concentrations will decrease. And now you have this massive population that no longer has access to phosphorus. So what's going to happen? Well, the algae will die and they'll sink to the bottom. And as the detritus or the dead algae accumulates on the bottom, our bacteria will begin to decompose them. Well, bacteria need oxygen to do this. And after a while, the bacteria will use up all of the oxygen at the bottom of these lakes, the bottom of these ponds, and the bottom of the ocean. And this can lead to what is known as a hypoxic environment. Hypo means below, and then oxic is referring to oxygen. So the oxygen levels are really low, and maybe fish can't tolerate the low oxygen levels. Or in worst case scenarios, like we see in the Gulf of Mexico, these areas can become anoxic, which simply means there's no oxygen present, and lots of fish will die as a result of this algal bloom, right? The algae grow and bloom because of the phosphorus. They run out of phosphorus, they die, they decompose. The bacteria that are breaking them down use up all the oxygen, and the fish can't breathe. And we call that whole process eutrophication. And you're gonna see this word over and over and over again. Nitrogen can also initiate eutrophication, again, because nitrogen is also a limiting factor. Okay, now let's look at some other kind of applications or other representations, right? So we know that phosphorus is trapped in rocks, right? And so it can be brought to the surface through geological uplift and be released through weathering and erosion. But people expedite this or speed this up by extracting phosphorus containing rocks from the earth to make fertilizers. And the actual mining process exposes a lot of the phosphates to runoff and to rain. And so that can significantly increase the amount of phosphorus in runoff, right? Or in streams, the simple act of mining, right? Removing trees, like deforestation, can result in more soil eroding, and that might contain phosphorus and ends up in streams and rivers. And then when we extract the phosphorus, we make fertilizers, we can apply it on farmland and fields. Well, when it rains, like it will, some of this fertilizer doesn't necessarily infiltrate into the soil, and it gets washed off with runoff into nearby streams. And all this excess phosphates end up in the water, whether it be a lake, pond, wetland, or an ocean. These dissolved phosphates are then going to cause that explosion in algae that I was talking about earlier. Now, in a normal situation, right, there's a balance here, right? Nature is waiting for phosphorus to weather and erode, and it takes forever. But the rate at which we mine it out of the earth, and the rate at which we apply it on farmlands, and the rate at which it now gets into streams and rivers, the uptake of the phosphorus by the marine animals is just not enough to necessarily control the population of algae. And that's why we end up with that eutrophication issue that I was talking about earlier. Now, there are some other aspects of the phosphorus cycle that I have yet to talk about. Obviously, plate tectonics can bring phosphorus back to the surface, as well as sewage, right? So any fecal matter, any waste, whether it's like cow manure, pig manure, or even human feces, if any of those feces end up in streams or rivers, there's going to be a great deal of phosphorus and nitrogen in those feces. Obviously, I pointed out fertilizers and mining waste will contain phosphorus, phosphates. But if you want to think about the natural cycle of phosphorus, whether we're talking about the cycling of phosphorus between plants and animals on land or in the water, phosphate ends up accumulating in oceans because it's slightly insoluble, right? Most streams and rivers lead to the ocean. And when it does reach the ocean, it kind of precipitates out of solution and forms a solid, sinks to the bottom, right? Now, it's at the bottom, but most phytoplankton are at the top. Well, there are these really neat deep water or deep ocean currents that actually push marine sediments back up to the surface. It's called upwelling. And upwelling can bring this phosphorus from the bottom of the ocean back up to the surface, which will initiate a natural increase in the phytoplankton population. And as there's more phytoplankton, you get more zooplankton. More zooplankton, you get more fish. And more fish will attract more seabirds. And the seabirds actually play a special role. They kind of link the marine and terrestrial phosphorus cycles. The fish will eat these birds, or the birds will eat the fish, and then they will roost and nest on land. And their guano, their feces, also contain a tremendous amount of phosphorus. And where do most seabirds nest and roost? They like estuaries, right? Which is one of the reasons why estuaries have such a high degree of primary productivity. And we'll talk about that tomorrow, is because they're bringing phosphorus from the ocean and redepositing it on land. And later on in the semester, I'll actually be showing you guys a clip from a video a good friend of mine made, as a friend that I went to college with. He's kind of like a professional filmographer, photographer, and rock climber. And he actually traveled to Yangshu, China, and actually filmed some of the local farmers climbing hundreds of feet above the ground to get bird guano from these cliff sides where the birds had been nesting and roosting, because the phosphorus was so valuable to their farms. The sulfur cycle also has a significant degree of, geological involvement, right? There's lots of sulfur. Sulfur is the number one the geosphere is the number one reservoir for sulfur, right? And so you're going to find it is like iron sulfides. Any metal tends to associate with sulfur, right, in the geosphere. There's also a lot of sulfur in fossil fuels, and most metals form ores with sulfur. And so when we bring these fossil fuels or ores, we bring these rocks to the surface for our use, right, we can release the sulfur into the atmosphere through smelting, right, which is how you extract metals out of ores, or burning fossil fuels to produce energy. And this will release various sulfur-containing gases. Now, right here, I've got listed sulfur dioxide, but you'll sometimes see me refer to these sulfur-containing gases as SOx, right? Because it could be sulfur dioxide or sulfur trioxide. Either way, we've taken sulfur that had probably been trapped in the earth for millions of years, and we've released it through some form of combustion in the atmosphere. Now, this also occurs naturally, right? There's a lot of geological activity that can release sulfur-containing gases or sulfur-containing compounds into the atmosphere. Things like volcanic eruptions, thermal hot springs, mineral pools, geysers, all of these things can release sulfur gas into the atmosphere. And hydrogen sulfide is what kind of gives these sulfur pools, these geysers and volcanoes that rotten egg smell. You probably also smelled this near the ocean when there's low tide. A lot of the bacteria in that coastal mud will actually break things down and produce hydrogen sulfide, which is why it smells like rotten eggs. But either way, whether it's through a natural process or a human-related or anthropogenic process, the sulfur that ends up in the atmosphere will find its way back to Earth. Now, it tends to form sulfuric acid in the atmosphere because of the presence of water, right? So these sulfur gases kind of dissolve and react with water and form sulfuric acid. Now, sulfuric acid can form crystals, and these crystals are actually really, really crazy. They can help form clouds, which also increases the reflectivity of the atmosphere, so reflecting solar radiation back into the atmosphere, and we'll talk a lot about that later. And these crystals can sometimes fall to the earth as a solid, right? And this is dry deposition. This is dry acid deposition. And so we tend to see sulfuric acid crystals or sulfate salts or dry deposition in arid climates, places where it might not be raining much, right? The sulfur can make its way back down in some form of dry salt or acid crystal. Now, it's clearly going to accumulate in the soils so that when it does rain, right, it'll obviously change the pH of that soil. Now, if there is substantial humidity and moisture in the air, the sulfuric acid will contribute to wet deposition. And this is typically referred to as like acid rain or acid snow. Yeah, you can have acid snow. Now, when you think of acid rain, don't think about it raining acid and your skin melting off, right? It's not quite that acidic. In fact, rainwater is already naturally acidic to begin with. So natural rainwater is somewhere between 5 and 6, right? Because there's already naturally a bunch of things in the air that are going to react with water and form acids. But the problem with increasing the amount of sulfur in the atmosphere is we're lowering this pH, right? And you start to get problems when you see pHs in this range. Now you might be thinking it's only dropped by 1 or 2 levels. Well, a 1 level drop in pH is a logarithmic scale. So it's actually, 5 is 10 times as acidic as 6. So if the pH of the rain was 6 and it drops all the way down to 4, right? If 5 is 10 times as acidic as 6 and 4 is 10 times as acidic as 5, that means that a pH of 4 is 100 times as acidic as something with a pH of 6. So this is serious, right? And so the sulfur can end up in the soil or back in the hydrosphere. And it will affect pH. But again, in natural circumstances, it's important for the sulfur to return back so that it can be assimilated by plants and animals again. Now, there is actually another way in which sulfur gets introduced into the atmosphere, and there's another way in which the oceans can interact with the coastal ecosystems, and I'll get to that in the next slide. Oh, I gotta clear this. Okay. So here we can see sulfur dioxide or SOx, right? And they can contribute to sulfate or acid rain deposition, which brings it back into the biosphere and the geosphere, right? It can go down and get trapped in rocks and be brought back up through geological uplift or volcanism or simply mining. And then the sulfur that does end up in the ocean, it can actually be reintroduced into the atmosphere through something known as DMS or dimethyl sulfide. And this, hold on, oh no. What have I done? Here we go. DMS is actually what gives the ocean its unique smell. All of us, I think probably all of us, have been to the ocean or the sea at some point. And when you're getting close because you get out of your car at the gas station and you can smell it in the air, right? It smells like the ocean. If you've been swimming in the ocean and you get out, it dries on your skin, you can smell it in your hair. Most of that is actually contributed to dimethyl sulfide. And dimethyl sulfide is a compound that is produced by phytoplankton and bacteria in the ocean, and it gets released into the atmosphere. And believe it or not, DMS plays an important role in forming clouds around coastal ecosystems. And clouds are important, right? Because the more clouds you form, the more condensation you get, and you can return fresh water to coastal ecosystems, as well as creating a reflective barrier for these coastal ecosystems, right? Reflecting some of that solar radiation back into the atmosphere, helping to regulate temperatures along these coastal environments. All right, and next up is the water cycle. Now, you guys have been learning about the water cycle since you were wee lads and lasses, since you were little boys and little girls. So I'm not going to go over this. See all these vocabulary terms? You're responsible for knowing the definition of these terms, right? This is old school information for you guys. I know that they beat this like a dead horse in middle school and elementary school. If you have any questions about any of these things, please don't hesitate to ask. I do want to talk a little bit more about groundwater, which I feel like is a neglected part of the water cycle and not necessarily addressed too much in elementary school, middle school, and it's really important. So when it rains or snows, any kind of precipitation and surface runoff, some of that water is going to infiltrate, right, the soil strata, right? So you got this layer of soil, and there's bits and pieces, small little spaces in between the soil particles, and water can find its way down through gravity, right? And eventually it'll end up in groundwater. Now, groundwater is not this giant, massive pool of water just sitting beneath your feet. It's actually a very, very dynamic body of water, right? You can see all these arrows here showing you how groundwater is flowing towards the ocean. It's always flowing in the path of least resistance, generally from a higher elevation to a lower elevation. Now, some of the water that infiltrates to the soil will actually eventually end up in porous, permeable rocks. And as the water moves through these porous spaces and permeable rocks, it displaces air and it displaces gas in a process known as percolation. You've seen this before. I know that there are old school ways of making coffee. One of them is called a percolator, and it kind of uses the same principle of like hot water falling between the little ground up particles of coffee bean, right? And percolating down. And what you need to realize is as water infiltrates and percolates through these soils and rocks, a lot of different things get dissolved, right? And can be carried through this process. But generally speaking, the further the water travels through the soil and percolates down, it's getting filtered, right? So that's why we like to get water from deep in these groundwater aquifers, right? Because we know that it's going to be um, clean or palatable, right? Because as it flowed through the soil and rocks, a lot of the nutrients have been removed. Now you will see that it does flow towards the ocean, and you do see that the ocean, because of its size and mass, is actually pushing some salt water into the groundwater table, right? So there's this push, this force between the two, between the ocean and fresh water pushing against each other. If we decrease the amount of fresh water in groundwater, or decrease the amount of fresh water in an aquifer, the ocean can push further inland. And we'll talk more about that later with the ways in which we have manipulated groundwater. And you have to realize too that this produces a tremendous amount of force upwards. And that's where in areas where maybe it hasn't rained in a long time and the groundwater table is lowering or the aquifer is becoming depleted, the ground can actually sink a little bit. But again, we'll talk more about that later. You do need to know where all the water is, right? So you do know that most of it's in the ocean, it's salty, and you do need to know the breakdowns of fresh water, where are the major reservoirs of fresh water. And as I mentioned before, the ways in which water can bounce around. You do need to realize that the hydrologic cycle is one of the most important parts of all of the other biogeochemical cycles, right? Without the hydrologic cycle, we wouldn't have the biogeochemical cycles, because things like carbon and nitrogen and phosphorus and sulfur, they get pushed and pulled and moved around a lot of times through water, right? And obviously the biosphere needs water to sustain life. But then any of them that have an atmospheric component are also going to be influenced by these weather patterns, right? Which have a lot to do with water, right? So the hydrologic cycle is a major part of all of the other biogeochemical cycles. And this cycle is powered by solar radiation. Solar radiation and gravity are the two driving forces here. Now, plants do play somewhat of a role, right? Because plants can actually absorb water from deep beneath the ground and release it through transpiration. It's actually a way in which they cool off, right? Believe it or not. And some trees can release, hundreds, if not thousands of gallons a day if it's nice and hot and sunny. And it's actually a neat way if you're like ever trapped in the woods of getting water from plants, and it would actually be clean. I'll show you guys how to do that later on in the semester. Does anyone have any questions? I know I was going a mile a minute, but a lot of information to get you all caught up, since most of you have not had any kind of earth or environmental class up until this point. I have already assigned the AP daily videos for your viewing pleasure in case you felt a little overwhelmed. And then one thing I do want to point out, right? When you go, when you go here to your little checklist, you can see you got some readings, right? And you know that you can find those in our library. This reading right here, the biogeochemical cycle, is where you're going to find your information about the sulfur cycle. But this can be read as a review of all of them, right? This has got a lot of really great, helpful information. And it's also going to expose you to more graphs, more diagrams, more breakdowns. And so I would strongly suggest looking at this, especially before your quiz on Wednesday. You do have 2 TQs tonight, 1.6 and 1.7. You can see what we got going on tomorrow. Wednesday, we'll have our quiz. And if you finish and get plenty of time, you can work on your research. But I do want to point out, on Friday, we will not have a class Zoom, right? I'm giving you the day on Friday to finish up your research projects and to get your final drafts turned in by Friday night. Okay, does anyone have any questions? If you do think of any questions later on, please don't hesitate to send me an email or to send me a message on the Remind. I did record this, as I record all lessons, and I do post them